It's episode 94 of the Author Stories podcast. I'm your host, Hank Garner. Find all of the archives of the show at hankgarner.com, and while you're there, please take a moment and sign up for the Insider Club. There you can get early access to episodes, access to a special forum where we talk about upcoming guests, and much, much more. Also, this episode is brought to you by audible.com. You can get a free trial that includes a free audiobook by going to audibletrial.com/Hank. I'm going to recommend one of David Kushner's books this week. David is my guest, and I discovered him through the Audible audiobook of his book, Masters of Doom. It's narrated by Will Wheaton, and it's a fantastic listen. So I would recommend you go to audibletrial.com, search for David Kushner, and pick up one of his books absolutely free with your free 30-day trial of the Audible service. Cancel it anytime if you don't like it, and keep your audiobook forever. Thanks for listening. Now here's my interview with David Kushner. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. I'm very excited about our guest this week. About a year ago, I picked up a book called Masters of Doom that completely enthralled me, and I then started seeking out other titles by this author, and have thoroughly enjoyed his work. And I reached out to David Kushner, and he was very gracious with his time and coming on the show this week. So welcome to the show, David.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. I begin every show with a variation of the same question, and that question is, how did you first know that you wanted to be a writer?
Well, I first knew, I suppose, when I was in college, and, I was taking a freshman writing class, and I realized that this was something that I could do without having to memorize textbooks, and which I really didn't enjoy doing. And I was like, I could write my freshman writing assignments sitting in an old beat up kind of used vintage reclining chair with music playing. And I said, I think this is for me. So that was pretty much it.
What first intrigued you? What were the kinds of stories that you wanted to tell initially?
Well, if you're going all the way back then, I had aspirations of writing fiction. But then what happened was I discovered the new journalists. So, writers like Hunter Thompson and Tom Wolfe and, that generation, Joan Didion. And I was really interested in that because, especially Hunter Thompson's work. And I was just like, wow, here's someone who's telling real stories that read like fiction. And it's a way that you can kind of see the world and experience all these different parts of life, but write about them in a way that's got elements of fiction, and that they're character driven and scene based, and also there was a practical side of it too, which is that there's getting into journalism. I was able to start to go out and sell a novel is one thing, but there was this market and this demand for journalism. I felt like it was more accessible. And in college, I started writing for the school paper, and then, really moved to New York with the intention, very specific intention of writing for Rolling Stone magazine. Or breaking into, writing for magazines. So that's kind of how that came about.
Well, like I said in the introduction, I was introduced to your work through your book, Masters of Doom. And I was a geeky kid growing up, and I was, as we get to a certain age, we start reminiscing, or get this kind of nostalgia for things that affected us as we were coming of age and that sort of thing. And I never, it's really hard to find good stories about those times and those people and that sort of thing. And that's what really intrigued me about Masters of Doom. And then when after I read that, then I started realizing that I had read some of your work before in Rolling Stone and in Wired and some other places. What was it specifically? And I listened to the audiobook of Prepare to Meet Thy Doom last week on a road trip, and I believe in your introduction you talk a little bit about kind of what made you decide to start pursuing some of those topics. Would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I too was sort of had all the geeky interest growing up. I mean, playing, being on computers and Atari, and my generation was like the Radio Shack TRS-80 computer and the Atari 2600, and
right,
then,
mine too.
And then, and also that was the era that was really the arcade fever. So those three things, I mean, that was really where those were my formative years. And then what happened, there was actually a very, very specific moment for me, which was walking into a Barnes and Noble. This is after I had been, writing for magazines, and because prior to writing for magazines, I was working at an early, internet company. It was a BBS, that was sort of before the web. These were the dial-up services, and I was at one in New York, which was kind of trying to be like the Rolling Stone of the early internet. And so then after I basically started writing, I saw an opportunity to write about that world, and I was interested. I was like, gosh, here's this whole world that's online, kind of the world on the other side of the screen. I saw an opportunity to write about. And then there was this moment of being in a Barnes and Noble and looking around, and I'm like, gee, there's all these books on sports and politics and music and film, but where are the books about this whole culture? Like, there's this huge culture out there, and I just felt like there were very, very few books about what I would now call like digital culture, that were character driven, stories about gamers and hackers and and all of that stuff. And there really wasn't much out there. So that was, I looked at that though as an opportunity, and I thought, well, why can't I be the guy who does that? Why can't I write that book? So that's really what set me on my way then to write a book, which ended up becoming my first book, which was Masters of Doom.
What was the process like for you? Well, first off, how did you pick this particular company and this particular point in time? What was it about id Software and that band of oddballs that went on to change, the face of digital gaming? And so how did you decide to focus on them?
Well, it was a process. It was a process. Like, I had written about, there was this ill-fated, Rolling Stone at one point was going to spin off a new magazine, which was going to be kind of like a Wired magazine. And I was assigned to write what would have been the cover story for this first issue, but the magazine never ended up happening. But the story that I pitched and was assigned was about John Romero. And John Romero, I think, actually looking back, and I haven't thought about it for a while, I think the magazine editor was like, I'd like to have you do a story about sort of like inside game development and like these people trying to get a game done. And I think the big one at the time was Daikatana, which was John Romero's, this was going to be his first big game after leaving id Software. So I ended up doing that story, and I went down, and that's where a lot of those scenes about the Daikatana development and Ion Storm and Masters of Doom came out of that assignment. And then I had met John Carmack, and I had and who was the co-founder at id Software. But essentially what happened was I had an idea. I wanted to write a book about the video game industry and or gamers. And originally the idea, I mean, I learned a lot about how you write and sell a book with that first one, because originally the idea was a book called Gamers, where it was just going to be sort of each chapter profiling a different subculture of gamers. But there was no story. It wasn't cohesive. And that's what I learned by working with an agent. And that you really had to, that's really what I tried to find I needed. And then it was really kind of one of these like 3 a.m. realizations where I was like, holy moly, like this is it right here. I have the story. It was the relationship of John Carmack and John Romero. And the reason why that made sense to me was multifold. Number one, primarily the most important thing was really it was about characters. It was about, I saw it as a story of friendship, and I actually jokingly kind of called it a geek love story, like a story of two friends who came from these really broken homes, kind of dysfunctional backgrounds, but they shared this passion for video games at a time when, there were just millions of obstacles for ordinary people to get into that industry. And then, they came together and created this incredibly influential video game startup that transformed the game industry, and they made tons of money, and they had fame and and success, but and they were rebels, but then they had this big falling out, and they went, and then that turned into a rivalry, and I'm like, this is everything, this story. And so that was what I pitched, and then that's what became Masters of Doom.
And you did a masterful job of highlighting those human elements. That was one thing that really captivated me when I was reading it for the first time, is that I didn't really know anything about the people id Software at all. I, like everyone else on the planet, had kind of been thrust into that, the excitement and even some of the politics and things that surrounded their games and creations. But I didn't know anything about the people there, and you really peeled the covers back, kind of skinned the onion, so to speak, on these guys. And at the end of the book, I remember just kind of being in awe of the way that the story read, like it was good literary fiction, but at the same time feeling like I was more connected to these real people. When you started pursuing this project, how much access did you have to the actual people? And since this is kind of a new field, were they distrustful of you, or kind of what was your relationship working with them?
Well, I had already done, like I said, I had already done that, the Daikatana story, so I knew John Romero, and then I think, I can't remember, but I think, pretty sure there was something I had done where I had met Carmack. So prior to doing the book, I had talked with each one of them and said, would this work? Can I talk to you? And they were both, basically had said okay, but then again, you don't really, they didn't certainly know what saying okay meant, and to a certain degree, I didn't know what saying okay meant because I'd never written a book. So it was a bit of I remember at the time, it was a bit of I felt a bit of a gamble because I picked up and moved down there, and I remember thinking to myself, I really don't know how this is going to go, and I hope it goes well. Because especially, Romero, I had known well. I interviewed him enough to know that I didn't think he was going to be a problem. He was a guy who loves to talk, and he loves history, and he loves sort of the story of Doom, and the story of id Software. So he was pretty much a lock. I figured that was fine. Carmack, although he kind of gave me a nod that it would be okay, I really didn't know how much I would get from him. And I specifically remember going down there one of the first nights, and I remember meeting him for dinner at like an Olive Garden or something. And I remember walking in there and thinking to myself, all right, well, here we go. Like, let's see what happens, because he was sort of notorious at the time. He still is considered one of the best computer programmers in the world, especially with graphics. And he was known to be kind of robotic, and that people said he was so technical, like, he's just, you're not going to get any stories from him. I'd heard a million reasons not to do it, not to talk to him, basically. But, you can't listen to everybody else. I mean, that's certainly one lesson I've learned. And, but, I sat down with him, and I remember I got up like 3 or 4 hours later, and I said, "This is incredible. Like, this guy's great. I mean, he's very reflective. I mean, if you ask him, and I think that's a good lesson in general. It's just like, you just got to approach people with an open mind and in a way that's genuine. And, I don't know. I like to think that if you spend enough time with someone or you approach them the right way, you can get them to open up. So that's what happened. And then I spent the next, several months reporting the book.
And every person has a story to tell, and I guess it's our job as writers to get in there and dig around until we find that story that's going to resonate with others.
Yeah, and that's why, I mean, for me, I was very cognizant of a couple things. I mean, one was that I was sort of telling two stories. I mean, there was this specific story, which is how these guys, subtitle says like, created built an empire and transformed pop culture and had so many firsts in the game industry. But then at the same time, I think the universal part of it, and the part which did resonate and actually still resonates today, is this. A lot of people look at that as a very inspirational story, and I do think it's a very iconic, inspirational story about the ultimate startup. Really, these guys who started kind of in a swamp house in Louisiana and got to the top of an industry. So, I was very aware that I was telling the story of a partnership and a kind of rags to riches story too.
When you're writing these true events, but writing them in a style that you do, and very Hunter Thompson-ish, is you cited as one of your influences. That definitely resonates in the colorful way that you portray these real characters. How much creative license do you get to take when covering these real events? Because it is your job to make these characters engaging and to highlight certain aspects and to really draw out the drama. So how do you balance the crafting these characters versus staying true to the real people?
Well, the short answer to that is that I take zero artistic license. Like I'm a real stickler about that.
Okay.
And in fact, it's like I'm so much of a stickler that I recently read The Devil in White City, and I have a lot of problems with that book because I think he did take too much license. In the sense that there are scenes in that book that if you really look at the footnotes and sort of reverse engineer what he did, I mean, he says that, he flat out made up scenes. And I would never do that. I feel like if you're going to write nonfiction, then write nonfiction. If you want to make a fictional story based on history, then do that. But don't. I think your relationship with your reader is very important, and it's based on trust. And if a reader doesn't know what to believe, then that you've broken that trust. And it is frustrating for me actually because, and I don't blame readers for this, but I think sometimes you get readers who don't read a lot of narrative nonfiction, and they'll come to a book like Masters of Doom and think that, oh, I must have made up dialogue, or I must have, but the truth is, and I tried to explain this in the footnotes to that book, but that, every line of dialogue, every scene, every detail is drawn from reporting. So it's drawn from conversations. For example, there's a dramatic scene where the owners get together and they fire John Romero, and it was a very emotionally charged scene. To render that scene, basically what I did was a variety of things. Number one, I went to the building. I went to oh gosh, it's been so long. What was the name of that building? The big black cube they worked in. Forgetting right now, but I went to that building where they worked. I poked my head around the office. I saw pictures so I could describe, like, what did it look like in there? Where was the door of it's like I want to know everything. Then I would go around and talk to each of the people who were at that table, and get and sort of triangulate the stories so that I had this person's version, that person. Everyone remembered something different, and then it's almost like a camera. If you picture a camera moving around the table, from each person's point of view. So that's basically how it's done. There was another scene, for example, where another owner was being fired, Tom Hall, and I remember when I interviewed him, I said, well, he was talking about the experience. It was very upsetting for him. And I said, well, what were you doing while this is happening? Do you remember what you were actually doing? He said, I actually do remember. I had this piece of tape that I was playing with, and I kept twisting it around my finger and untwisting it. I'm like, that's a fantastic detail, because it's just so specific. So I described that in the story. So, I put a lot of effort into that, and I'm very meticulous about it.
Yeah, and it definitely shows. There's a way that you get inside these characters' heads, and that's a perfect example of the wrapping the tape, because you feel the anxiety and the things that are going on with that character. Amazing. Mm-hmm. Did you, and with any of your books, have you come into a situation where you have conflicting accounts between two characters? And if so, how do you resolve those?
Well, sure. That definitely happens, because that's life. People remember different things. There's this famous movie, Rashomon, which is about a crime, and it's from the different points of view. So, again, with that, what I try to do, or using Masters of Doom as an example, I might say, trying to think of a specific scene, but I would say, like, here's. Well, actually, there was a scene specifically. There's different accounts of who said what to someone. So what I'll say is, I'll say it from each person's point of view. Like, in John Romero's mind, this was happening. In Carmack's mind, this was happening. So you attribute it as much as you want. Sometimes there are times when, as the writer, you have to place your bet as to what really happened. And what really happened might be sort of an amalgamation of the different points of view. I think that's all. I think everything is legit as long as you're transparent with the reader. So in other words, if you say to the reader, here's what this person said happened, this person doesn't remember that, and they said this, or you say accounts, the accounts were varied, no one seemed to agree on what happened, but it seems like this is probably how it went down. So I think that's just how you do it.
Well, they say there's three sides to every story. There's party A side, party B side, and then there's the truth somewhere. So I guess as a writer, it's our job to display those and then look for the inconsistencies and maybe what really happened.
Yeah, I think so, and I think also just let your reader figure it out. I really am a big fan of that. Like I like, in fact, I got knocked after Masters of Doom came out. There was one criticism um, that a few people had, which was basically, I didn't press hard enough, for example, on the controversy about violence in video games because Doom became the lightning rod about Columbine.
Sure.
And, but my feeling was I'm just one person. I don't care that much about what I think. I really don't. And so therefore, I don't think the reader should care too much about what I personally think as one individual. Rather, what I was trying to do is just sort of lay it out there and let the reader make up his or her mind. I mean, it's another thing about that book that's interesting is that, I mean, the response to it that I find interesting is people talk about it of being not of an entirely sympathetic portrayal of these people, and they talk about it. There are things in there that are not admirable. Like, for example, John Carmack takes his cat to a shelter, where it's probably fate is not going to be great for that cat. That's upsetting to people. As personally, for me, I have cats, so yeah, that doesn't make me happy, that story. But I'm not going to sit there and write that, oh, he was a heartless bastard for doing that. Like, I feel like you can read that and draw your own conclusion. So
Well,
maybe,
and
yeah,
David, there are things about me that are not admirable, and
yeah,
I'm
of
sure there are
course.
things about you that are
I
not
probably have one or
admirable.
two things. Yeah,
Yeah, so that makes us three-dimensional people.
yeah. Yeah, I agree. And also I just think it's like and sometimes and I do even now I push back against that. I love the editors I work with, but this is something where sometimes someone will say, I'll get encouraged to weigh in more, and I always feel a little uncomfortable doing that. It's just not my style. I mean, I'm not knocking people whose style it is, but personally, it's just not my style. I mean, I prefer to just tell a story, and let the reader figure it out. Of course, that said, I mean, I have my biases. I mean, yes, I grew up as a gamer. Yes, I think that the arguments that violence, that Doom could cause Columbine, I find that to be absurd. But I try to take myself out of it a bit as I'm writing the story.
Well, and there's no shortage of reporting on connections of violence in video games and that sort of thing. What there is a shortage of is reporting that actually tries to get in the head of the people, and I love that that's the approach that you took.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank
Uh,
you.
so you also have written a couple of other books about geek culture, Johnny Magic and the Card Shark Kids, how a gang
Hmm.
of geeks beat the odds and stormed Las Vegas, and then you also wrote a book called Jacked, the outlaw story of Grand Theft Auto. How do you find these stories, and what is the criteria that you use that makes you go, you know what, this is a story I really want to find out what really happened at?
Hmm.
How do you pick those?
Um, well, there's two answers. I mean, one is that um, I do a lot of magazine feature writing, so um, that the criteria for those stories is very different than the criteria for a book. If I, for example, I write a magazine story about Anonymous, and the hacktivist group, I know that I have maybe 5 to 10,000 words to tell the whole story in, and I'm going to have to be more selective, and I may just have one character who I'm really focusing on, or what have you. For a book, like any of the ones you mentioned, it really requires not only a good story and something rich, but is there enough here to sustain it over 300 pages? And not, I've been asked a lot about, well, you write a book about Doom, the guys who made Doom. Well, why not for example, do a book about the creators of World of Warcraft. Warcraft obviously is a massively successful game, hugely influential. And my answer to that is, at least as far as I'm aware, and it's possible I'm not aware of something, but as far as I'm aware, I just don't think there's a story behind Warcraft that has the right ingredients, at least for me, to sustain it over 300 pages. Again, like Masters of Doom, the reason that worked was not only the magnitude of the game and all of that, but was the story of these two people. With Jacked, the story of Grand Theft Auto, it's fun. It's like that had all different kinds of challenges because my access to the creators of the game was limited. Actually, was zero once I started writing the book. So I had to approach it differently. But I had access to them in the years prior, so I had a lot of research to draw from. But to tell you the truth, even if I had total access to the guys at Rockstar while I was doing it, I would not have written it the way I did Masters of Doom, because to me, the central conflict was not between the people at Rockstar. I was interested. That book to me was different. Like, that was about the cultural controversy more. It was about, and then I really zeroed it in on Sam Hauser, who was the, one of the co-founders of Rockstar Games, and this guy, Jack Thompson, who was, kind of a right-wing culture warrior. So those were my two protagonists. So, you're, in a way, you're casting a book like you're casting a movie. Johnny Magic, that book was similar in that, like, after writing Masters of Doom, I really wanted to write a book about a gamer. Like, I wrote about the game makers. Now I wanted to write about a player, and I was interested. That book was about this idea of, like, how people can be how people can be transformed by a game, and specifically about this guy, John Thinkball. I thought it was just this incredible, one of the most incredible stories of personal transformation I'd ever really heard. Like, this guy just, really making him over from being just this stereotypical kind of high school loser who, thought of himself that way, to being, like kind of the Michael Jordan of this geeky sport. So I thought that was a cool story. So that's how I look at it.
Gotcha. I'd like to shift gears just a little bit and talk about your new book, Alligator Candy, Memoir. For someone who's kind of built a reputation on the kind of reporting that you've done and the kind of books that you've written, and I know you've written a couple of other books that are not necessarily geek culture type of things, but you decided to do a memoir, but a very personal and a very specific topic that this one focuses on. Can you tell us about the idea and the story behind Alligator Candy?
Yeah, I mean, so that is, it's a memoir, and of course it's highly personal. I mean, it's about, when I was a kid, when I was about 4 years old, I had an older brother who was 11 at the time, and who was, randomly, abducted and murdered after going to a convenience store, biking to a convenience store near our house. And, that is a story that I had lived with my entire life, and it was obviously terrible tragedy, and it had so much in it, many, many different layers for me. I mean, not only the personal loss, but the story of, like, gosh, how did my parents survive this? I was really interested in that question of, for any book that I write, there's sort of this specific story, but then there's a larger question, and to me, or larger story. To me, this one was, how does an individual, how do you survive something that you feel like you can't survive? Like, I thought that was a universal question. So, and we all face that, in a million ways. So, but at the same time, that was also just kind of a mystery story that I was solving for myself in terms of who was my brother, what really happened, how did my family survive, and but what was different is that I reported it. So it wasn't just a memoir of me sitting around thinking. I mean, there was that, but I approached it like a journalist. So I actually went out, interviewed people, looked at a case file, looked at newspaper stories. So I really reported it just as I would anything. So it's kind of, I think of it as like a reported memoir. So, yeah, and I mean, look, of course, the subject matter is different, but to me, my what I do for a living is I tell stories. Like, I think that some of them are, yes, and of course, the stories that I choose to tell are ones that reflect my personal interests. So I'm interested in geek culture and that. So I write about that. But, I'm also interested in crime stories, probably for personal reasons. So I have done a ton of crime stories. I've done a lot of bank heist, hacker stories. I just find those compelling. I've written a number of civil rights stories, and um, that's another interest of mine. So I wrote a book called Levittown, which was really a civil rights story. So yeah, I mean, with the new book, to me, it's a personal story, but it was fundamentally just it was another story that I wanted to report and write.
I'm reading Levittown right now. I just
Yeah.
started a couple days ago, and one of the first impressions I got is, well, this is definitely a David Kushner book.
Yeah, really?
Yeah, I mean, your voice
Yeah.
is very consistent across your work, and I
Yeah.
love that about it. But in Alligator Candy, when you got the idea for this and you started pursuing it, um, where you and your immediate family
Mhm.
are the central characters to the story,
Yeah.
as opposed to these people that you can, draw a dividing line and separate yourself from them. And at the end of the day, you can go home and have your life while you shelve these other people's story
Yeah.
until you come back to work on it. So when you're intimately involved, where you and your family are the central characters, uh, how is the process different for that? And I know you said that you approached it like a reporter, but you're still intimately involved with this. Was that different for you? And how do you handle that struggle between being the reporter and being the reported?
Hmm. Yeah, of course it's dramatically is a dramatically different story for obvious reasons. And I don't know. I never thought about it like that. But yeah, I mean, I guess this was one that of course that I couldn't leave behind. So it was much more immersive. And actually, it's funny, like looking back, the process was different because I took breaks. Like I took breaks of several months between drafts. I not even consciously. I didn't even sit down and say, well, I need to put this aside for 8 months. It just turned out that's just what happened. So I think I just had to approach it differently. But yeah, and I had the luxury of being able to take my time. So, and I needed to take my time for that. I mean, I'm working on for these other books, and the next one I'm going to do, those are more like it's sort of the opposite. I sort of push everything aside and just try to really stay in it at once. This one was a little different.
Yeah. Did you learn anything from writing a memoir that you think might be beneficial to other writers?
Um, I don't know because I think that genre is so I think I've just read so many of them while I write every one I could get my hand on. and I read all what I consider to be the great ones, and they're each so different. I think that people have to take their own approach. So it's hard for me to say, but for me, I guess I'm kind of interested in maybe a subgenre of the memoirs, which I'll call reported memoirs, and there have been a couple others like David Carr, the late David Carr, wrote a book called The Night of the Gun. He'd been an addict for years, and he basically forgot his life, and he went out reporting it. So, I don't know. For me, a reported memoir, it was an interesting experience, and I guess what I learned was that by not only relying on my own memories, but by harvesting other people's memories and reporting it, I felt that I could tell a richer story than I could have done just on my own.
Yeah. I think we've all read memoirs that were phenomenally done, and there's also some that you read that are just kind of glorified navel gazing.
Yeah.
Does the reported memoir, do you think that helps to kind of insulate against some of this just kind of brutal self flagellation that seems to be?
I hope it did for me. I hope it did for mine. I mean, because I can't tolerate that. I mean, that was honestly, it was like a big thing for me was like I don't have the stomach for that, and I didn't want to be the person like sitting on a daytime talk show like wringing my hands. Like I felt like I wanted to tell. I'm always interested in. I guess it goes back to like what I was saying before. I don't want it to be just about me. So hopefully that did work. But again, I also don't want to have I don't want to have like so much humility that it takes away from the story because, this story is very particular. So I did feel responsibility to really go deep within myself and talk about it because I know that I had lived through this experience that was extremely unusual. So if I was going to tell it, I wanted to really, I felt like I should go to that place and the writing of it.
David, thanks so much for taking time to come on the show. Where can people follow your work? I know your Amazon page has your books listed, but where can people follow your short works that you publish and kind of keep in touch with what's going on with you?
Yeah. Well, so I have a website, which is just my name, davidkushner.com. And that I try to keep that up to date with most of all the new articles, but there are a bunch on there as well as links to the books and media appearances. And then I'm also somewhat active on Twitter, so that's just at David Kushner.
Excellent. We're going to put links to all of your books and your website in the show notes. David, I'm a huge fan, and thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. That was a great conversation with you, so I appreciate it.